What started as an innocent family photograph would become one of the most chilling discoveries in American history. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible historical stories. The summer of 1870 pressed down on Louisiana like a fever that refused to break. 5 years had passed since General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, yet the air itself seemed thick with the ghosts of the old world. On Magnolia Grove Plantation, 30 miles upriver from New Orleans, the past and present existed in an uneasy dance, each step carefully choreographed to maintain the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. Colonel James Beaumont stood on the wraparound porch of his antebellum mansion, watching the morning mist rise from the cypress swamps. At 45, he carried himself with the rigid bearing of a man who had commanded troops in battle, but the war had left its marks. His left hand trembled slightly, a souvenir from Gettysburg, and his steel-gray eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there before the conflict began. The morning air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the earthy smell of the river, a combination that had once symbolized prosperity but now seemed to mock the family's declining fortunes. The plantation house itself was a monument to a vanishing way of life. Built in 1847, its white columns rose 2 stories high, supporting a roof that had sheltered 3 generations of Beaumonts. The intricate ironwork on the balconies spoke of a time when such details were commissioned from New Orleans artisans without concern for cost. But prosperity was now a carefully maintained illusion. The war had cost Colonel Beaumont more than his health. It had devastated his finances. Confederate bonds had become worthless paper, and the transition from slave labor to sharecropping had proven more expensive than anticipated. Northern creditors demanded payment on pre-war debts, while the devastated Southern economy offered few opportunities for generating the cash needed to meet these obligations. The cotton market remained unstable, and competition from other regions had driven prices to levels that made profitable operation nearly impossible. Colonel Beaumont had been forced to sell off portions of the plantation's original 3,000 acres, and he lived in constant fear that he might lose the rest to foreclosure. Each morning brought new anxieties about bills that couldn't be paid, and creditors who grew more insistent with each passing month. Inside the house, Margaret Beaumont moved through her morning routine with practiced grace. At 38, she remained beautiful in the way that Southern ladies of her generation cultivated. Pale skin, protected from the sun, dark hair arranged in elaborate styles that required careful attention to detail. She had married James in 1860, just as political tensions were reaching their breaking point. Their honeymoon had been interrupted by the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and their early years of marriage had been defined by separation, uncertainty, and the gradual erosion of everything they had expected their life together to be. Margaret's daily correspondence with relatives throughout the South revealed a network of families all struggling with similar challenges. Letters spoke of plantations sold, fortunes lost, and young men who would never return from the battlefields. Yet there was also a determination to maintain dignity and social position despite the changed circumstances. Margaret had learned to make do with fewer servants, to stretch household budgets, and to present an appearance of normalcy even when the foundations of their world had shifted beneath their feet. Their son Thomas, now 8 years old, was the light of Margaret's life and the hope of the Beaumont legacy. Born in 1862 during the darkest days of the war, he had known only the aftermath of conflict. His childhood was spent in a world where former slaves were now free, but still worked the same fields, where his parents spoke in hushed tones about money troubles and the uncertain future. Thomas was a precocious child, already showing signs of the intelligence that had built the family fortune, but his parents worried about what kind of world he would inherit and whether the skills and values they were teaching him would be relevant in the new order that was emerging. The boy's education was carefully managed by Miss Adelaide Rousseau, a refined lady from Baton Rouge whose own family had fallen on hard times after the war. She came 3 times a week to provide Thomas with instruction in Latin, mathematics, literature, and the social graces that were expected of a young gentleman. But even these lessons carried undertones of uncertainty, as traditional expectations about class and privilege were being challenged by the realities of Reconstruction. Among those others was Samuel Washington, a 12-year-old boy whose presence in the Beaumont household occupied a space that was both central and invisible. Samuel had been born on the plantation in 1858, during the final years of legal slavery, when the institution seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the Mississippi River itself. His mother, Ruth, had worked in the big house since she was 14, eventually becoming the head cook, whose skills were renowned throughout the parish. Her ability to create elaborate meals from limited ingredients had become even more valuable in the economically straitened post-war years. Ruth's story was one of survival and adaptation that reflected the experiences of millions of enslaved women throughout the South. Born on a neighboring plantation, she had been sold to the Beaumonts in 1850 as part of a debt settlement between the two families. She had given birth to 5 children during her years of bondage, but only Samuel and his 2 younger sisters, Mary and Grace, had survived to see freedom. Disease, malnutrition, and the harsh conditions of plantation life had claimed the others before their second birthdays, losses that Ruth carried with her in a silence that spoke of grief too deep for words. His father, Moses, had been a field hand whose intelligence and leadership abilities had made him valuable to the plantation's operations, but also dangerous in the eyes of the overseer. When Samuel was 3 years old, Moses had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi, a transaction that had torn the family apart, with the casual cruelty that characterized the slave system. The sale had been motivated partly by economic considerations and partly by the overseer's desire to remove a potentially troublesome influence from the slave quarters. Samuel retained only fragmentary memories of his father, a deep voice singing work songs, strong hands lifting him onto broad shoulders, and the devastating morning when Moses had simply disappeared from their lives forever. Now, in this supposed era of freedom, Ruth found herself in a position that differed little from her previous bondage. She worked the same job, lived in the same cabin, and received wages that were immediately consumed by rent and food purchases that kept her family perpetually in debt to their former master. The sharecropping contract she had signed was written in language she couldn't read, and the arithmetic that determined her family's share of the crop was calculated by men who had every incentive to ensure that the debt never decreased. Samuel occupied an even more precarious position. Too young for field work but old enough to be useful, he served as a house servant, personal attendant to young Thomas and general laborer. He received no wages of his own. His labor was considered part of his mother's contract, and his future remained entirely dependent on the Beaumont family's goodwill. His intelligence was both an asset and a liability. It made him more valuable as a servant, but also more dangerous as a potential source of discontent among the other workers. The relationship between Samuel and Thomas was complex and fraught with contradictions. They were close in age and had grown up in the same house, yet their lives were governed by entirely different rules. Thomas attended lessons while Samuel cleaned the schoolroom. Thomas ate at the family table while Samuel served the meals. Yet despite these differences, the two boys had developed a relationship that defied easy categorization, sharing moments of connection that had to be carefully hidden from the adults who governed their world. The summer of 1870 had been particularly difficult for the Beaumont family. The cotton crop had been damaged by early blight, and Colonel Beaumont's creditors were becoming increasingly insistent about overdue payments. There were rumors that other plantations in the parish were being sold to northern investors who had little interest in maintaining the traditional social arrangements that had governed rural Louisiana for generations. It was in this context of mounting pressure and anxiety that Colonel Beaumont had commissioned Edmund Hartwell, a traveling photographer from New Orleans, to create a family portrait. The photograph was intended to document the family's continued prosperity, provide a formal record for posterity, and project an image of stability that might help in negotiations with creditors. The colonel understood the power of appearances in a society where reputation and social standing were often more important than actual wealth. Hartwell had arrived at Magnolia Grove on a humid Tuesday morning in August, his wagon loaded with the complex apparatus required for photography in the 1870s. He was a man in his 30s, originally from Massachusetts, who had come south after the war, seeking opportunities in the defeated Confederacy. His photographic business catered primarily to wealthy families eager to document their survival and continued prominence in the new order. But Hartwell was also a man of conscience, troubled by what he witnessed in his travels through the post-war South. He saw the fear in the eyes of black servants, witnessed the casual cruelty of their employers, and understood that the legal end of slavery had not brought genuine freedom to the people he encountered in his professional travels. Colonel Beaumont had specific ideas about how the photograph should be composed. The family would be arranged on the front porch with the white columns as backdrop, emphasizing their social position and continued prosperity. He would stand in authority. His wife would be seated to display refinement, and young Thomas would suggest the continuation of the family line. But the colonel also insisted on including Samuel in the photograph, a decision that reflected the complex racial dynamics of the Reconstruction era. However, Colonel Beaumont's instructions to Hartwell went beyond simple composition. In a conversation later documented in Hartwell's private letters, the colonel made it clear that he expected complete cooperation from all subjects, and he was prepared to ensure that cooperation through whatever means necessary. "The boy can be difficult," Colonel Beaumont told Hartwell. "He's gotten ideas about his place since the war ended. I want to make sure he understands the importance of presenting the right image for this portrait." The morning of the photograph, Samuel had been awakened before dawn by his mother, who helped him dress in his best clothes: a cotton shirt that had been carefully mended and pants that showed the wear of constant use. Ruth's hands shook slightly as she combed his hair, and Samuel could sense her anxiety, even though she tried to hide it from him. "You just stand where they tell you and don't say nothing," she whispered. "Keep your eyes down and your mouth shut, and it'll be over soon. Don't give them any reason to find fault with you." As the family took their positions, Samuel found himself positioned at the edge of the group, his bare feet planted on the wooden planks, his body rigid with tension that went far beyond normal nervousness. He could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him, the knowledge that any mistake would have consequences extending far beyond the moment. Hartwell made his final adjustments to the camera and prepared the photographic plate. The exposure would take nearly 30 seconds, requiring all subjects to remain perfectly still while the camera captured their images in silver and light. "Hold perfectly still," Hartwell instructed. "Any movement will blur the image." As the family froze into position, Samuel felt his heart racing. His eyes, trained by years of vigilance to detect danger, caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. In Hartwell's right hand, partially concealed by his position behind the camera, was the unmistakable outline of a pistol. The weapon was not pointed directly at Samuel, but its presence was clear and its message unmistakable. The exposure began, and for 30 seconds that felt like an eternity. Samuel stood frozen, not just by the photographic requirements, but by terror so profound that it seemed to stop time itself. His eyes, wide with fear, stared directly into the camera's lens. And in that moment, the reflection of Hartwell and his weapon was captured in the dark mirrors of Samuel's pupils with precision that would remain hidden for nearly 150 years. When the exposure was complete, Samuel was dismissed with a curt nod. As he walked away from the porch, he carried with him the knowledge that this moment of terror had been preserved forever, though he could never have imagined that someday technology would exist to reveal the truth of what had happened and give voice to his silent suffering. Edmund Hartwell's journey back to New Orleans that August evening was haunted by the weight of what he had witnessed and participated in at Magnolia Grove. The dusty road that wound along the Mississippi River levee seemed to stretch endlessly before him, and with each mile, the moral implications of the day's work pressed more heavily upon his conscience. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Louisiana landscape, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood on his hands. Metaphorically speaking, though the weight felt no less real. Hartwell had not come to Louisiana seeking to become complicit in racial violence. Born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1835, he had grown up in a family of modest means, but strong moral convictions that had shaped his worldview from an early age. His father, a clockmaker whose shop occupied the ground floor of their modest home, had been an active supporter of the abolitionist movement, and their house had served as a stop on the Underground Railroad during Edmund's youth. The young man had absorbed these values through countless dinner-table conversations about justice, equality, and the moral imperative to oppose slavery wherever it existed. His introduction to photography had come during his military service, when he was assigned to assist the famous war photographer Matthew Brady during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. The experience of documenting the brutal realities of warfare had been transformative for Hartwell, opening his eyes to the power of the camera to preserve truth and bear witness to history in ways that written accounts could never match. He had seen how a single photograph could capture the horror of a battlefield, the dignity of a fallen soldier, or the determination of men fighting for a cause they believed in. Photography, he had come to believe, was not just an art form, but a moral instrument capable of revealing truth and promoting justice. The decision to come south after the war had been motivated by a mixture of economic opportunity and genuine curiosity about the transformation taking place in the defeated Confederacy. Northern newspapers were full of stories about Reconstruction, about efforts to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society as full citizens with equal rights and opportunities. Hartwell had imagined himself as a documentarian of this historic transformation, capturing images that would show the world how America was healing from the wounds of slavery and war. But the reality he encountered in Louisiana was far more complex and troubling than the optimistic accounts he had read in the Northern press. The legal end of slavery had not brought genuine freedom to the people he met in his travels through the rural parishes and urban neighborhoods of the state. Instead, he found a society that had adapted its methods of racial control to the new legal framework, creating systems of sharecropping, debt peonage, and legal discrimination that maintained many of the essential features of the old slave system, while technically conforming to the requirements of federal law. The Black Codes, passed by Southern state legislatures immediately after the war, had effectively criminalized many aspects of black life and created new mechanisms for controlling the formerly enslaved population. Vagrancy laws allowed for the arrest of unemployed black men, who could then be sentenced to forced labor on public works projects or leased to private employers who paid the state for their services. Apprenticeship laws permitted the seizure of black children from their families under the pretense of providing them with education and training. But in practice, these programs often amounted to a form of legalized kidnapping that separated families and provided free labor to white employers. Contract labor laws bound black workers to their employers in ways that differed little from slavery, creating systems of debt and dependency that made it virtually impossible for workers to leave their jobs or seek better opportunities elsewhere. The contracts were written in language that most formerly enslaved people could not read, and the arithmetic that determined wages and expenses was calculated by employers who had every incentive to ensure that their workers remained perpetually in debt. Hartwell had witnessed these systems in operation throughout his travels, but the commission from Colonel Beaumont had forced him to confront his own role in perpetuating them. The colonel's insistence that he carry a weapon during the photographic session had crossed a line that Hartwell had not previously been asked to cross, transforming him from a passive observer of injustice into an active participant in the intimidation and control of a black child. The pistol that Colonel Beaumont had pressed into his hand was a Colt Navy revolver, a weapon that Hartwell recognized from his military service and that carried with it memories of violence and death that he had hoped to leave behind when he entered civilian life. The colonel had been matter-of-fact about the necessity of its presence during the photograph, explaining that the boy had been getting ideas since the end of the war and needed to be reminded of his place in the social hierarchy that the Beaumont family was determined to maintain. "Samuel's a smart one," the colonel had said as they prepared for the photographic session. "Too smart for his own good, if you ask me. His mother's been filling his head with notions about schooling and such, and some of the other servants have been talking about leaving to find work in the city. We can't have that kind of thinking spreading among the help, especially not now, when we need every hand we can get to bring in what's left of the cotton crop." Hartwell had wanted to refuse, to pack up his equipment and leave Magnolia Grove without completing the commission that had brought him there. But he was a businessman as well as an artist, and the Beaumont family was paying him well for his services at a time when his own financial situation was precarious. Moreover, he told himself, his presence might actually provide some protection for the boy. Surely the colonel would not resort to actual violence with a witness present, especially a northern witness who might report such incidents to federal authorities. But as the photographic session progressed, Hartwell realized that his presence was not protecting Samuel. It was being used to terrorize him. The boy's eyes, wide with fear and fixed on the camera lens, had stared directly at Hartwell throughout the exposure, and the photographer could see the reflection of his own figure, weapon in hand, captured in those dark pupils. The image that was supposed to document the Beaumont family's prosperity and stability was instead preserving a moment of pure terror, a child's fear frozen in silver and glass for posterity. The technical aspects of the photograph had proceeded flawlessly, despite the moral horror of the circumstances. The lighting was perfect, the composition was balanced, and the exposure time had been sufficient to capture sharp detail throughout the frame. Hartwell's years of experience had served him well, and he had produced what would undoubtedly be considered a successful portrait by the standards of his profession. But he knew that he had created something far more significant than a simple family portrait. He had documented a crime, even if the law of 1870 Louisiana would not have recognized it as such. The development process in his New Orleans darkroom revealed the full extent of what he had captured. As the image slowly appeared in the developer solution, Hartwell could see every detail with crystal clarity: the rigid postures of the family members, the elaborate architecture of the plantation house, and most disturbingly, the unmistakable terror in Samuel's expression. The boy's face, which had seemed merely serious during the actual photographic session, now revealed layers of fear and anguish that were heartbreaking to witness. The completed photograph was delivered to the Beaumont family as contracted, along with several additional prints for distribution to relatives and business associates throughout Louisiana and other southern states. Colonel Beaumont expressed satisfaction with the result, noting that it captured exactly the image of stability and prosperity that he had wanted to project to the world. The payment was made promptly and in full, and Hartwell's business relationship with the family was concluded successfully from a purely commercial standpoint. But the photographer's personal reckoning with what he had done was just beginning. In the weeks following the Magnolia Grove session, Hartwell found himself unable to concentrate on his work with the same enthusiasm and dedication that had previously characterized his professional efforts. The image of Samuel's terrified face haunted his dreams, and he began to question whether his entire enterprise in the South was morally defensible, or whether he had become complicit in a system of oppression that he had originally come to document and expose. His correspondence from this period, preserved in the archives of the New Orleans Public Library, reveals a man in the grip of a profound moral crisis that would ultimately transform his life and career. In a letter to his sister dated September 15, 1870, he wrote with unusual candor about his experiences. "I came to this troubled land believing that I could serve as a witness to its transformation, that my camera could capture the birth of a new and more just society rising from the ashes of slavery and war. Instead, I find myself complicit in the perpetuation of the very evils I had hoped to see eliminated. The families I photograph present themselves as dignified and prosperous, but I see the fear in the eyes of their colored servants. These people are not truly free, dear sister, though the law proclaims them so." The letter continued with a passage that would prove crucial to historians' understanding of the Beaumont photograph and the circumstances surrounding its creation. "Today, I was compelled to photograph a family whose patriarch insisted that I carry his pistol during the session, claiming it was necessary to ensure the cooperation of their houseboy. The child's terror was palpable, yet I completed my work as contracted. I fear I have become complicit in perpetuating the very cruelties I came south to document. The boy's eyes will haunt me for the rest of my days, for I know that in them was reflected not just my own image, but the image of a society that has found new ways to enslave those it claims to have freed." Hartwell's crisis of conscience led him to make a dramatic decision that would effectively end his career as a photographer in the South. In October 1870, just 2 months after the Beaumont session, he closed his photographic business in New Orleans and returned to Massachusetts. abandoning the lucrative market he had spent years developing. He used his remaining savings to purchase a small farm outside Salem, where he lived quietly for the rest of his life, rarely speaking of his experiences in the South and never again practicing photography as a profession. But before leaving Louisiana, Hartwell made one final gesture that would prove significant to future historians and researchers. He donated his entire collection of glass plate negatives to the Louisiana Historical Society, along with a detailed catalogue of each image and the circumstances of its creation. The catalogue entry for the Beaumont family portrait was particularly detailed and would later provide crucial context for understanding the photograph's true significance. Magnolia Grove Plantation, August 1870. Family portrait of Colonel James Beaumont, his wife Margaret, son Thomas, and house servant Samuel. Note, this photograph was taken under circumstances of coercion. The subject Samuel was intimidated by the presence of a firearm during the session. The photographer was compelled to participate in this intimidation against his moral convictions. This image should be understood not as a document of family prosperity, but as evidence of the continued oppression of the colored population in post-war Louisiana. This catalogue entry, buried in the archives for nearly 150 years, would later provide crucial context when Dr. Chen and Marcus Williams made their groundbreaking discovery. Hartwell's detailed description of the circumstances surrounding the photograph's creation confirmed what their digital analysis had revealed, that Samuel's terror was not imagined or projected by modern viewers, but was a documented reality that the photographer himself had witnessed and recorded. The years following Hartwell's departure from Louisiana saw the gradual erosion of the limited gains that had been made during the early years of Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 effectively ended federal protection for black civil rights in the South, and the region entered the era that historians would later call the nadir of American race relations. The systems of legal segregation, economic exploitation, and racial violence that Hartwell had witnessed in their infancy became fully institutionalized, creating a racial caste system that would persist well into the 20th century. Samuel had remained with the Beaumont family until 1875, when the deteriorating economic situation and his own growing awareness of the possibilities that existed beyond the plantation finally motivated him to make the dangerous journey to freedom. At 17, he had accumulated enough savings and courage to leave Magnolia Grove and make his way to New Orleans, where he hoped to find work and begin building a new life for himself and his family. The photograph that had preserved that moment of terror continued to exist in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society, filed away among thousands of other images from the Reconstruction era. For nearly 150 years, it would remain nothing more than a historical curiosity, viewed by the occasional researcher, but never subjected to the kind of detailed analysis that would reveal its hidden secrets and transform it into one of the most important documents of American history. Edmund Hartwell died in 1891 on his small farm in Massachusetts, taking with him the full knowledge of what he had witnessed and participated in that day at Magnolia Grove. His final letter to his sister, written just weeks before his death, contained a passage that seemed to anticipate the eventual discovery of the truth hidden in the photograph. "I have carried the burden of that day for more than 20 years, and I go to my grave knowing that I failed to speak out against the evil I witnessed, but I take some comfort in knowing that the truth has been preserved, captured in silver and glass, waiting for a time when the world will be ready to see it clearly. Someday I believe that boy's story will be told, and the world will understand what really happened in those dark days after the war." Dr. Sarah Chen had always been fascinated by the intersection of technology and history, a passion that had been shaped by her unique perspective as the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had come to America seeking better opportunities for their children. As a child growing up in San Francisco in the 1980s, she had watched her parents navigate between two worlds, the traditional Chinese culture of their birth and the rapidly evolving digital landscape of their adopted home. This experience of living between past and present, of seeing how technology could bridge seemingly impossible gaps, had shaped her academic interests and eventually led her to specialize in digital restoration and analysis of historical photographs. By 2019, Dr. Chen had established herself as one of the leading experts in her field, with a reputation that extended far beyond the academic world. Her work at Tulane University's Digital Humanities Center had revolutionized the study of historical photography, using cutting-edge technology to extract information from old images that their original creators never could have imagined capturing. She had worked on projects ranging from Civil War battlefield photographs to early 20th century immigration documents, always searching for the hidden stories that lay beneath the surface of seemingly straightforward historical images. Her approach combined rigorous technical analysis with deep historical knowledge, recognizing that digital enhancement was only as valuable as the context and interpretation that accompanied it. She had developed new algorithms for noise reduction and image sharpening, but she had also spent countless hours in archives and libraries, studying the social and cultural contexts that had shaped the creation of the photographs she analyzed. This combination of technical expertise and historical understanding had made her work particularly valuable to museums, universities, and research institutions around the world. The Louisiana Historical Society's digitization project had been Dr. Chen's most ambitious undertaking to date, a comprehensive effort that would transform how researchers and the public could access the state's rich photographic heritage. The Society's archives contained over 50 Louisiana photographic images, spanning more than a century of Louisiana history, from the earliest daguerreotypes of the 1840s to color photographs from the 1960s. The collection included everything from formal portraits of wealthy families to candid street scenes, from documentation of natural disasters to records of political events and social movements. The goal was to create a comprehensive digital archive that would make these images accessible to researchers around the world while preserving the fragile originals from further deterioration. The project had been funded by a combination of federal grants, private donations, and university resources, reflecting the growing recognition of the importance of preserving America's visual heritage for future generations. Dr. Chen had assembled a team of graduate students, technical specialists, and historians to work on different aspects of the digitization process, each bringing their own expertise and perspectives to the massive undertaking. Marcus Williams had joined the project in the fall of 2019, drawn by his interest in the visual documentation of slavery and its aftermath. A doctoral candidate in American history at Tulane, Marcus brought both academic rigor and personal passion to his work. His great-great-grandfather had been enslaved on a Louisiana sugar plantation, and Marcus felt a deep connection to the historical images that documented the experiences of people like his ancestor. He understood that these photographs were not just historical artifacts, but were also family documents that could help him and others understand their own heritage and identity. Marcus was particularly interested in photographs from the Reconstruction-era, a period that he believed had been misunderstood and misrepresented in popular historical narratives. The traditional story of Reconstruction portrayed it as a time of chaos and corruption when vindictive Northern politicians and incompetent black officials had mismanaged the South's recovery from the Civil War. But Marcus's research had convinced him that this narrative was largely a product of white supremacist propaganda, designed to justify the violent overthrow of Reconstruction governments and the imposition of Jim Crow segregation. The photographs from this period, Marcus believed, could provide crucial evidence for a more accurate understanding of what had really happened during Reconstruction. But he also knew that these images had to be approached with caution and critical analysis. Photography in the 19th century was not the casual, spontaneous medium it would later become. Every photograph was a carefully constructed performance, with subjects posing for long exposures in arrangements that reflected the social hierarchies and power relationships of their time. The Beaumont family photograph had been among the first images that Marcus selected for detailed analysis when he began working on the digitization project. The catalogue entry, based on Edmund Hartwell's original notes, had immediately caught his attention with its unusual level of detail and its explicit mention of coercion. Here was a photograph that the photographer himself had described as being taken under circumstances of coercion, with specific reference to the intimidation of the black subject. If Hartwell's description was accurate, This image might provide rare visual evidence of the violence and intimidation that had characterized the post-war South. The digitization process began with the careful removal of the glass plate, negative from its protective storage sleeve, a delicate operation that required specialized equipment and extensive training. The plate, measuring 8 by 10 inches, was remarkably well preserved despite its age, a testament to the quality of Hartwell's original work and the care with which the Louisiana Historical Society had maintained its collection. The emulsion, the light-sensitive coating that had captured the original image, remained intact, with only minor scratches and dust spots that could be digitally corrected during the enhancement process. Dr. Chen positioned the plate on the high-resolution scanner with the precision of a surgeon, making minute adjustments to ensure that every detail would be captured with maximum clarity. The scanner was a state-of-the-art machine that represented the cutting edge of digital imaging technology, capable of capturing details at a resolution of 4,800 dots per inch, far exceeding the resolving power of the human eye. Each scan took several hours to complete, as the machine methodically recorded every microscopic detail of the photographic emulsion, building up the digital image pixel by pixel with extraordinary precision. The thing people don't realize about these old glass plates, Dr. Chen explained to Marcus as they watched the scanning process unfold on the computer monitor, is that they often contain far more information than anyone could see at the time they were made. The emulsion is incredibly fine-grained, and with modern digital enhancement techniques, we can often reveal details that were invisible to the original photographer and his contemporaries. As the scan progressed, the image slowly appeared on the computer monitor with stunning clarity, each detail emerging with a sharpness and definition that would have amazed Edmund Hartwell. Every thread in the family's clothing, every grain of wood in the porch planks, every leaf on the trees in the background emerged with photographic precision that revealed the extraordinary quality of 19th-century photographic technology when properly preserved and analyzed. But it was when they reached Samuel's portion of the image that something extraordinary began to become apparent to the trained eyes of the researchers. His face, which had appeared merely serious in lower-resolution reproductions of the photograph, now revealed layers of emotion and expression that were deeply unsettling to witness. "Look at his expression," Marcus said, leaning closer to the monitor as the details of Samuel's face became clear. "There's something in his eyes that goes beyond normal nervousness about being photographed. This is fear, real, profound terror." Dr. Chen began the process of digital enhancement, using sophisticated algorithms that she had developed and refined over years of working with historical photographs. The software could distinguish between original image data and age-related deterioration, allowing her to remove the effects of time while preserving the authentic details that had been captured by the camera. She used a combination of techniques: deconvolution algorithms to reverse the effects of optical blur, noise reduction filters to eliminate grain and artifacts, and edge enhancement to bring out fine details that might otherwise remain hidden. "There's definitely something there," Dr. Chen agreed as she worked, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard as she adjusted parameters and fine-tuned the enhancement process. "Let me try to enhance just the eye area and see what we can find." The enhancement process was painstaking and required multiple iterations, each one revealing new details, while also requiring careful analysis to ensure that the enhancements were revealing genuine photographic data rather than creating digital artifacts. Dr. Chen had seen too many cases where overzealous digital processing had created false details that researchers had mistakenly interpreted as historical evidence, and she was determined to maintain the highest standards of scientific rigor in her work. After several days of intensive work, a pattern began to emerge in Samuel's pupils that made both researchers pause in amazement. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a reflection of light from the photographer's equipment, a common occurrence in 19th-century portraits where the bright light sources used for illumination often created reflections in the subject's eyes. But as Dr. Chen refined the enhancement further, the reflection began to take on a more definite and disturbing shape. "This is incredible," she whispered, staring at the monitor with a mixture of excitement and horror. I think we're seeing a reflection of the photographer himself, and there's something in his hand." Marcus moved closer to examine the enhanced image, his heart racing as he began to understand the implications of what they were discovering. In the dark mirror of Samuel's left pupil, magnified and clarified by digital processing, was the unmistakable silhouette of a human figure standing behind a camera, exactly as one would expect of a photographer taking a portrait. But there was something else in the image, something that made both researchers catch their breath and stare at the screen in stunned silence. In the figure's right hand, clearly visible despite the tiny scale of the reflection, was what appeared to be a pistol, its distinctive shape unmistakable even at such minute size. The weapon was not pointed directly at Samuel, but its presence was clear, and its implications were staggering. "That can't be right," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That has to be some kind of optical illusion or digital artifact. There's no way we're actually seeing what I think we're seeing." But Dr. Chen was already running additional analyses to verify what they were observing, her scientific training demanding that she subject their discovery to the most rigorous testing possible. She applied different enhancement algorithms, examined the image at various magnifications, and compared the reflection to known optical patterns and photographic phenomena. She consulted with colleagues who specialized in optics and 19th century photography, seeking independent verification of their findings. Every test confirmed the same conclusion: the reflection was genuine. It was part of the original photographic emulsion, and it clearly showed Edmund Hartwell holding a weapon while taking the family portrait. The implications were staggering and would force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the visual record of the Reconstruction era. If their analysis was correct, this photograph provided visual evidence of something that historians had long suspected but never been able to prove: that the apparent compliance and cooperation of black subjects in post-war photographs might have been achieved through explicit threats of violence rather than genuine consent or cooperation. Dr. Chen and Marcus spent the next week subjecting their findings to every form of verification they could devise, determined to ensure that their discovery would withstand the most rigorous scrutiny from the academic community. They consulted with optical physicists to confirm that the reflection was geometrically consistent with Hartwell's position behind the camera. They brought in experts on 19th century firearms to verify that the object in the reflection was indeed a pistol of the type that would have been available in 1870. They even commissioned an independent laboratory to examine the digital file for any signs of manipulation or fraud. Every test confirmed their initial findings. The reflection in Samuel's eyes was authentic. It was part of the original photograph, and it clearly showed the photographer holding a weapon during the portrait session. The discovery would transform their understanding of this particular image and raise profound questions about the nature of historical evidence and the hidden stories that might be waiting to be discovered in archives around the world. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic community when Dr. Chen and Marcus published their initial findings in a preliminary report that was immediately picked up by major news outlets around the world. The story of the hidden gun in the 1870 family photograph captured public imagination in a way that few academic discoveries ever do, sparking conversations about the legacy of slavery, the reality of Reconstruction, and the power of technology to reveal hidden truths about the past. But the discovery also raised troubling questions about the nature of historical evidence and the ethics of photographic interpretation that would continue to be debated long after the initial excitement had died down. Some scholars argued that Dr. Chen's enhancement techniques were revealing details that the original photographer never intended to capture, and that modern viewers were imposing their own interpretations on ambiguous visual data. Dr. Robert Thornton, a prominent Civil War historian at the University of Virginia, was among the most vocal critics of the findings. "We have to be extremely careful about reading too much into these enhanced images," he argued, in a response published in the Journal of American History. "Just because we can digitally manipulate a photograph to reveal certain details doesn't mean we should assume the worst about every interaction it depicts. The reflection could be of any number of objects, and we're allowing our modern sensibilities about racial violence to color our interpretation of what is essentially ambiguous visual data. But Marcus and Dr. Chen stood firm in their interpretation, supported by the growing body of evidence they had assembled. The technical analysis was clear, the historical context supported their conclusions, and Edmund Hartwell's own written description of the circumstances surrounding the photograph provided crucial corroboration for their findings. The Beaumont photograph had become more than just a historical document. It had become a catalyst for a fundamental reconsideration of how historians understood the visual record of the Reconstruction era, and a powerful reminder that the past was often more complex and troubling than it appeared on the surface. The revelation of the hidden truth within the Beaumont family photograph had transformed Marcus Williams from a graduate student working on a digitization project into one of the most sought-after experts on Reconstruction-era photography. Invitations to speak at conferences poured in from universities across the country. Documentary filmmakers sought his expertise for their projects, and major news outlets requested interviews about the implications of his groundbreaking discovery. But despite the professional recognition and media attention that had suddenly thrust him into the spotlight, Marcus found himself haunted by a single, deeply personal question. What had happened to Samuel Washington after that terrifying day in 1870? The search for Samuel's story became an obsession that consumed Marcus's days and invaded his dreams, driving him to spend countless hours in archives, libraries, and cemeteries throughout Louisiana. He understood that finding the truth about one boy's life would not fundamentally change the broader historical narrative about Reconstruction, but he also believed with passionate conviction that individual stories had the power to illuminate larger truths in ways that statistical analyses and policy studies could never achieve. Samuel's face, frozen in that moment of terror and preserved in silver and glass, had become a symbol of the millions of formerly enslaved people whose experiences had been marginalized or erased from the historical record. Marcus began his search in the most obvious place, the extensive records of Magnolia Grove Plantation itself, which were housed in the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge. The archives contained a wealth of documentation spanning more than a century of the plantation's operations, including ledgers, correspondence, legal documents, and business records that provided detailed insights into the economic and social structures that had governed life on the estate. But finding information about individual enslaved people and their descendants proved to be a frustrating and often heartbreaking challenge that reflected the broader invisibility of black lives in the historical record. The plantation records from the slavery era were meticulous in their documentation of human property, treating enslaved people as valuable assets that required careful tracking and management. Births, deaths, sales, and purchases were all carefully recorded for accounting purposes, with detailed information about the monetary value of each individual and their potential for generating future profits. But these records typically identified enslaved people only by first names, ages, and brief physical descriptions, treating them as interchangeable units of labor, rather than as human beings with complex identities, relationships, and aspirations. The breakthrough came when Marcus expanded his search to include church records from the local African Methodist Episcopal congregation, which had been established in the area shortly after the war as part of the broader effort by formerly enslaved people to create independent institutions that would serve their spiritual and social needs. The AME Church had been founded by black ministers who had broken away from white-controlled denominations, and its records proved to be a treasure trove of information about the formerly enslaved community that was far more detailed and humanizing than anything found in the plantation archives. Unlike the plantation records, which viewed black people primarily as economic units, the church records documented births, marriages, deaths, and family relationships with careful attention to individual identity and community connections. The ministers who kept these records understood that they were preserving not just administrative information, but also the human dignity and worth of people who had been systematically dehumanized by slavery. In the baptismal records from 1871, Marcus found an entry that made his heart race with excitement. Samuel Washington, son of Ruth Washington, age 13, baptized by Reverend Joshua Freeman on the third Sunday of March. The entry included a notation that Samuel could read and write, an unusual accomplishment for a formerly enslaved child that suggested both exceptional intelligence and access to education that most of his peers lacked. This detail was particularly significant because literacy had been illegal for enslaved people in most southern states, and the ability to read and write was often seen as a dangerous skill that might encourage resistance or escape. The church records also revealed that Samuel had two younger sisters, Mary and Grace, and that the family had remained in the area for several years after the war, actively participating in the religious and social life of the newly formed black community. The records showed regular attendance at Sunday services, participation in church fundraising activities, and involvement in the mutual aid societies that provided support for community members in times of illness, unemployment, or other hardships. But the trail went cold in 1875, when the Washington family's names disappeared from the church rolls without explanation or forwarding information. Marcus suspected that this was when Samuel had made his escape from the plantation system, but he had no direct evidence to support this theory. The sudden disappearance of families from church records was not uncommon during this period, as economic pressures, racial violence, and the search for better opportunities drove many formerly enslaved people to migrate to cities or other regions where they hoped to find greater freedom and prosperity. The next phase of Marcus's research took him to New Orleans, where he hoped to find traces of Samuel's life in the city's extensive archives and records. New Orleans in the 1870s had been a magnet for formerly enslaved people seeking economic opportunities and greater freedom from the oppressive conditions that characterized rural Louisiana. The city offered the possibility of wage labor, access to education, and the anonymity that came with urban life, making it an attractive destination for those who had the courage and resources to make the dangerous journey from the countryside. After days of searching through microfilm records in the New Orleans Public Library, Marcus found what he was looking for. In the 1880 census for New Orleans, Ward 6, he discovered an entry that made his pulse quicken. Samuel Washington, age 22, laborer, born Louisiana. The record showed that Samuel was living in a boarding house in the Treme neighborhood, one of the city's most vibrant black communities, and working as a dock laborer on the busy wharves that lined the Mississippi River. Most significantly, the census indicated that he could read and write, confirming the education that had been noted in the church records from his childhood, and suggesting that he had continued to develop his intellectual abilities despite the limited opportunities available to black people during this period. This detail was particularly important because literacy was still relatively rare among formerly enslaved people, and those who possessed this skill often found themselves in positions of leadership within their communities. The 1880 census also revealed that Samuel was married to a woman named Elizabeth Thibodeau, age 19, who had been born in New Orleans to parents who were listed as free before the war. This detail was significant because it suggested that Samuel had married into the city's established free black community, a group that had maintained its own institutions and social networks even during the slavery era, and that possessed valuable cultural knowledge and social connections that could help newcomers navigate the complex racial dynamics of urban life. Marcus's research into the Thibodeau family revealed a fascinating story of survival and resistance that predated the Civil War and provided important context for understanding Samuel's later life. Elizabeth's father, Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, had been a skilled carpenter who had purchased his freedom in the 1840s through years of careful saving and negotiation with his owner. He had established a successful business serving both black and white clients, and had used his earnings to purchase property in the Treme neighborhood and to secure the freedom of other family members. The marriage between Samuel and Elizabeth represented more than just a personal union. It was a bridge between two different segments of the black community in New Orleans. Samuel brought the experience of plantation slavery and the struggle for freedom, while Elizabeth brought the cultural knowledge and social connections of the established, free black community. Together, they would navigate the complex racial dynamics of the post-Reconstruction era and build a life that, while constrained by segregation and discrimination, represented a remarkable triumph over the circumstances of Samuel's birth. Marcus was able to trace Samuel's family through city directories and other sources that documented their gradual rise in economic and social status. By 1885, Samuel had left dock work and established himself as a carpenter, likely learning the trade from his father-in-law and benefiting from the connections and reputation that the Thibodeau family had built over decades of successful business operations. The family had moved to a small house on Ursuline Street in the Tremé, and Samuel had become active in the local AME Church and the Longshoremen's Benevolent Association, an early labor organization that fought for the rights of black dock workers. The 1900 census showed that Samuel and Elizabeth had 6 children: Ruth, named for Samuel's mother, James, Mary, Thomas, Grace, and Samuel Jr. The family owned their home, a significant achievement for a formerly enslaved person, and Samuel was listed as a contractor, indicating that his carpentry business had grown successful enough to take on larger projects and employ other workers. All of the children who were old enough were attending school, reflecting Samuel's commitment to education as a path to advancement and his determination to provide his children with opportunities that had been denied to him. But Marcus also discovered evidence that Samuel's success had come at a considerable cost, both financial and emotional. New Orleans in the 1890s was becoming increasingly hostile to black achievement as the brief period of Reconstruction-era progress gave way to the systematic disenfranchisement and segregation of the Jim Crow era. The Louisiana Constitution of 1898 had effectively eliminated black voting rights through literacy tests and poll taxes, and a series of segregation laws had restricted black access to public accommodations, transportation, and employment opportunities. The personal toll of these pressures was evident in the oral histories that Marcus collected from Samuel's descendants, who had preserved family stories and memories that provided insights into the emotional and psychological impact of living under Jim Crow segregation. Dorothy Washington Johnson, Samuel's granddaughter, was 89 years old when Marcus contacted her in 2020, but her memories of her grandfather remained vivid and detailed, providing a window into the private life of a man whose public achievements had been constrained by the racial barriers of his time. Grandpa Samuel was a proud man, Dorothy told Marcus during their first meeting at her home in the Tremé, a modest shotgun-style house that had been in the family for 3 generations. He never talked much about his time on that plantation, but you could see it in his eyes sometimes. There was a sadness there, a wariness that never went away completely. He was always watching, always careful, like he was expecting trouble to come around the corner. Dorothy's house was filled with photographs spanning more than a century. Formal portraits from the early 1900s, family gatherings from the 1920s and 1930s, and more recent images of children and grandchildren who had benefited from the foundation that Samuel had worked so hard to build. But it was the oldest photograph that captured Marcus's attention, a formal portrait of Samuel taken around 1920, when he was in his early 60s and had achieved a measure of stability and respect within his community. The man in the photograph bore little resemblance to the terrified 12-year-old boy from the Beaumont family portrait. Samuel's hair was gray, and his face was lined with age and experience, but his posture was erect, and his expression was dignified. He wore a well-tailored suit and held himself with the bearing of a man who had overcome tremendous obstacles to build a successful life. Yet even in this formal portrait, Marcus could see something familiar in Samuel's eyes, a wariness, a guardedness that spoke to a lifetime of vigilance and the permanent psychological scars left by his experiences under slavery and its aftermath. He used to have nightmares sometimes, Dorothy continued, her voice soft with memory and emotion. Grandma Elizabeth would wake us up when he was having one of his spells. He'd be muttering about cameras and guns, about white men with weapons. We didn't understand what he was talking about then, but now I think I do. Now I understand what he was remembering. Dorothy's account provided crucial confirmation of the trauma that Samuel had carried with him from that day in 1870. The terror that had been captured in the photograph had not been a momentary fear that faded with time. It had become a permanent part of his psychological landscape, surfacing in dreams and memories throughout his life and affecting his relationships with his family and community. But Dorothy also shared stories that revealed Samuel's remarkable resilience and his determination to transform his trauma into something positive for future generations. He had been largely self-taught, but he had insisted that all of his children receive formal education, even when the costs strained the family budget. He had saved money to purchase property and had worked tirelessly to establish his carpentry business, viewing economic independence as essential to protecting his family from the kind of vulnerability he had experienced as a child. He used to tell us that education was the one thing they couldn't take away from you, Dorothy recalled, her eyes bright with the memory of her grandfather's words. He said that knowledge was power, and that as long as we kept learning and growing, we could overcome anything they tried to do to us. He made sure all his children could read and write, and he was so proud when my father became a teacher. Samuel's commitment to education had indeed paid dividends for his descendants. His son James had become a teacher in the New Orleans public school system. His daughter Mary had worked as a seamstress and later opened her own shop, and his youngest son, Samuel Jr., had served in World War I and later worked for the Postal Service. The family had maintained their property in the Treme and had become pillars of the local community, active in church, civic organizations, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. Marcus also discovered that Samuel had been involved in early civil rights organizing in New Orleans, participating in efforts that would lay the groundwork for the more famous movements of the mid-20th century. Records from the NAACP's New Orleans branch, founded in 1915, showed that Samuel had been among the organization's early members and had participated in efforts to challenge segregation laws and protect black voting rights. This activism had required considerable courage, as black civil rights organizers faced constant threats of violence and economic retaliation from white supremacist groups and sympathetic authorities. The final chapter of Samuel's life was documented in the records of the Charity Hospital of New Orleans, where he had died in 1923 at the age of 65. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but the hospital records also noted that Samuel had suffered from what would now be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic insomnia, anxiety, and recurring nightmares that had persisted throughout his adult life and had likely contributed to his declining health in his final years. Samuel's funeral had been held at the St. Augustine Catholic Church in the Treme, and the obituary published in the New Orleans Tribune described him as a respected member of the community who had overcome the hardships of his youth to build a successful life and raise a family that was a credit to the race. The obituary made no mention of his experiences during slavery or the specific trauma that had shaped his early life, reflecting the tendency of the black press to focus on achievements and progress rather than dwelling on the painful memories of the past. Marcus's research into Samuel's life had taken more than 2 years to complete, involving countless hours in archives, libraries, and cemeteries, as well as extensive interviews with family members and community historians. But the story that emerged was far richer and more complex than he had initially imagined. Samuel Washington had not simply been a victim of the racial violence that characterized the post-war South. He had been a survivor who had transformed his trauma into a determination to build a better life for himself and his family, and whose legacy continued to inspire his descendants more than a century after his death. The discovery of Samuel's full story added new dimensions to the significance of the Beaumont family photograph and transformed it from a simple piece of historical evidence into a powerful symbol of resilience and resistance. The image was no longer just documentation of a moment of terror. It was the beginning of a narrative of survival and triumph that had played out over more than half a century, demonstrating the remarkable capacity of human beings to overcome even the most devastating trauma and build meaningful lives in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. In 2023, the Louisiana Historical Society organized a special exhibition titled Hidden Truths: What Photographs Don't Tell Us, with the Beaumont family portrait as the centerpiece of a display that combined cutting-edge digital analysis with extensive historical research and oral history collection. The exhibition also featured a section dedicated to Samuel Washington's life after 1870, including photographs of his family, documents from his work in New Orleans, and oral histories collected from his descendants that provided a human face to the broader historical narrative of Reconstruction and its aftermath. The exhibition drew visitors from around the world, many of whom came specifically to see the Beaumont photograph and learn about the digital techniques that had revealed its hidden truth. Interactive displays allowed visitors to see the enhancement process in real time, watching as the reflection of Edmund Hartwell's pistol slowly emerged from the darkness of Samuel's pupils. The museum also created educational materials that explained the historical context of the photograph and its significance for understanding the reality of life during Reconstruction. On the opening night of the exhibition, Dorothy Washington Johnson was invited to speak about her grandfather's legacy to a crowd of historians, students, community members, and several of Samuel's living descendants. Standing before the enlarged image of the 1870 photograph, she addressed the audience with a voice that remained strong despite her advanced age. "My grandfather used to say that the truth has a way of coming out, even when people try to bury it," she said, her words carrying clearly through the hushed gallery. He never could have imagined that his pain would be preserved in that picture, or that someday people would have the tools to see what really happened that day. But I think he would be proud to know that his story is finally being told, and that it's helping people understand what life was really like for folks like him. She paused, looking directly at the photograph, where her grandfather's 12-year-old face stared back at her across the centuries, and continued with words that would resonate with everyone present. He always said that remembering the truth was the only way to make sure it never happened again. And now, thanks to people like Dr. Chen and Marcus, his voice is finally being heard. Dorothy's great-grandson, Michael Washington, was also present at the exhibition opening. A 25-year-old graduate student at Xavier University, Michael represented the sixth generation of Samuel's family to live in New Orleans. He had grown up hearing stories about his ancestors' experiences, but seeing the photograph and learning about the research that had revealed its hidden truth had given him a new appreciation for his family's history and the struggles that had made his own opportunities possible. "It's incredible to think that all this time, the evidence was right there in the photograph," Michael told Marcus after the ceremony. "My great-great-grandfather's terror was preserved for almost 150 years, waiting for someone to have the technology and the determination to see it. It makes me think about what other stories are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered." The exhibition ran for 6 months and attracted visitors from around the world. Many came specifically to see the Beaumont photograph and learn about the digital techniques that had revealed its hidden truth. But others were drawn by the broader questions that the discovery had raised about the nature of historical evidence and the ongoing legacy of slavery and racial violence in American society. The impact of the discovery extended far beyond academic circles. The photograph had become a symbol in contemporary discussions about racial justice, historical memory, and the importance of confronting uncomfortable truths about the American past. Social media campaigns used the image to illustrate the hidden violence that had underpinned seemingly peaceful interactions between Black and white Americans throughout history. And the story had been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and educational materials that reached millions of people around the world. Educational institutions across the country began incorporating the Beaumont photograph into their curricula, using it to teach students about the importance of critical analysis and the ways that technology could be used to reveal new perspectives on historical events. The image became a powerful tool for demonstrating that history was not a fixed narrative, but an ongoing process of discovery and reinterpretation that required constant questioning and investigation. The photograph also sparked important conversations about the ethics of historical research and the responsibilities that came with uncovering traumatic truths. Some critics argued that the digital enhancement of Samuel's terror was a form of exploitation, turning his pain into an object of academic study and public consumption. Others contended that revealing these hidden truths was essential for understanding the full scope of historical injustice and its ongoing effects on American society. Dr. Chen and Marcus addressed these concerns in their subsequent publications and presentations, emphasizing their commitment to treating Samuel's story with dignity and respect. They worked closely with his descendants to ensure that the family's perspectives were included in all discussions of the photograph, and they donated a portion of their speaking fees to organizations working to preserve African American history and culture. The discovery also had practical implications for the field of digital humanities and historical research. The techniques that Dr. Chen had developed for analyzing the Beaumont photograph were refined and applied to other historical images, leading to new discoveries about everything from Civil War battlefields to early 20th century labor conditions. The Center for Enhanced Historical Analysis became a model for similar institutions around the world, demonstrating the potential for technology to transform our understanding of the past and reveal stories that had been hidden for generations. But perhaps the most important legacy of the discovery was its demonstration of the power of individual stories to illuminate larger historical truths. Samuel Washington's experience on that August day in 1870 was just one moment in the vast sweep of American history, but it provided a window into the reality of life for millions of formerly enslaved people during the Reconstruction era and its aftermath. The photograph that had seemed so innocent for 149 years had become one of the most important pieces of evidence about the failure of Reconstruction and the rise of the Jim Crow system. It showed that the legal end of slavery had not brought genuine freedom to the people it was supposed to liberate, and that the violence and intimidation that had characterized the slave system had simply taken new forms in the post-war era. The story of the Beaumont family photograph serves as a powerful reminder that history is not always what it appears to be on the surface, and that the most important truths are sometimes hidden in the smallest details, waiting for the right technology and the right questions to bring them to light. In Samuel Washington's eyes, captured forever in silver and glass, we see not just the reflection of a photographer's gun, but the reflection of a nation's conscience, a reminder that the work of justice is never finished, and that the voices of the oppressed will always find a way to be heard, even across the vast expanse of time. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through history. If this story moved you and opened your eyes to the hidden truths in our past, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more amazing historical discoveries. Share this story with others who need to hear these important voices from the past. Remember, history is not just about dates and facts. It's about real people whose stories deserve to be told. The truth has a way of emerging, even after 150 years, and it's our responsibility to listen, learn, and ensure these voices are never silenced again. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep listening to the echoes of truth that surround us every day.